Silas launched the buzzing toy drone into the night sky, carrying a signal that would either lead the hunters away or bring the entire mountain down on their heads. Beside him, the alien woman gripped his arm, her bioluminescent blood staining the snow a neon, sickly blue. One wrong frequency and the dropship overhead would turn the ridge into a glass crater. Have you ever wondered why the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy are terrified of a species that still uses gunpowder and tape? Join us as we uncover the true cost of human mercy in the cold of Oakhaven. Now let's see how this hunt began. A week ago, the hardest decision Kaylin Nix had faced was whether to report a minor fuel discrepancy in her squad's logistics. That was before the intercept, before the screaming descent, and before the frost barons of Earth claimed everyone she had ever served with. Kaylin lay in the wreckage of the Valyrian scout ship, her vision swimming in rhythmic pulses of red. The atmosphere was too thick, the temperature too low, and her internal stabilizers were failing. Through the jagged hole in the cockpit, the stars above didn't care about her blood in the snow, but the man with the scarf did. He moved through the blizzard with a heavy, rhythmic trudge, his face obscured by a thick wrap of wool. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a scavenger. He knelt beside her, and Kaylin flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that had been melted into the hull. She had been taught that humans were reckless, unpredictable predators who viewed the galaxy as a resource to be harvested. But as her life signs faded, she looked into the man's eyes through his fogged goggles. She saw no hunger there, only a grim, focused necessity. "Help," she rasped, the word a wet click in her throat. The man, Silas, didn't ask for her rank or her intent. He simply unwound a long strip of his heavy wool scarf and tied it tightly around her thigh to stem the flow of blue light. The fabric was rough, smelling of wood smoke and old grease, but it was warm. "Pain," he grunted, hoisting her onto a primitive wooden sled. The journey to his cabin was a blur of jarring impacts and the whistling wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and scorched metal. Silas worked in a silence that felt heavy, almost tectonic. He wasn't understanding the circuitry of her medical bracer like a scientist. He was bullying it into working, using a soldering iron and a pair of rusted pliers to bridge connections her people deemed delicate. By the third day, the sky changed. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the cabin floor, a sound Kaylin knew too well. The scavenger swarm had followed the crash trajectory. They weren't here for a rescue. They were here to harvest the survivor and the tech. Silas stood by the window, watching the flickering lights of the descent pods. He didn't flee. Instead, he began grabbing rolls of industrial foil and scraps of lead lining, frantically taping them over the gaps in the cabin walls. "They're scanning for biosigs," Kaylin warned, her voice stronger but still thin. "They'll find us." "Not through this mess," Silas muttered, his jaw set in a hard line. "Not on my watch." The thrumming in the floorboards intensified, shifting from a vibration to a bone-deep rattle. Outside, the forest was no longer dark. It was lit by the cold, rhythmic strobing of alien searchlights cutting through the pine needles. Silas grabbed a heavy rucksack and a modified flare gun, his movements devoid of the panic Kaylin expected from a civilian. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to the blue-stained wool wrapped around her leg. "Can you walk?" Kaylin gritted her teeth, pushing off the cot. "I can crawl if it means not ending up in a swarm processing tank." "Good enough," Silas said. He didn't lead her toward the back exit. Instead, he kicked open the front door, exposing them to the biting frost and the mechanical shriek of a dropship banking overhead. Kaylin watched as he began tossing small, blinking canisters into the treeline. They looked like junk, tin cans wrapped in copper wire and duct tape. "Human diplomacy," he muttered, catching her look of confusion. They scrambled into the dense brush just as the first swarm soldiers breached the clearing. They were spindly, multi-limbed horrors clad in reactive armor that shimmered like oil on water. As they converged on the cabin, Silas clicked a remote detonator. The diplomacy spoke. The forest erupted not with a single blast, but a cascading series of concussive thumps. Silas hadn't built traditional bombs. He'd built localized EMP bursts and magnesium flares that blinded the swarm's infrared sensors. The aliens shrieked, their coordinated movements breaking into chaotic, overlapping circles, which meant the readings were wrong. The swarm's tactical computers couldn't process the lack of logic in the traps. But the distractions only bought seconds. A heavy dropship, realizing the ground troops were compromised, leveled its main ventral battery toward the cabin. A low whine signaled the charging of a heavy plasma beam. "Move!" Silas roared. He didn't wait for her to agree. He threw her arm over his shoulder and practically carried her toward a hidden ravine choked with frozen brambles. Behind them, the air turned white. The cabin, Silas's home and everything he owned, was vaporized in a silent, searing flash of heat that turned the snow to steam. Kaylin slumped against a rock wall, the heat of the explosion stinging her back. "You lost everything," she whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the embers of his life drift into the night sky. "I'm still breathing, aren't I?" Silas snapped. "Now shut up and help me with the drone." He pulled the toy from his bag. It was a cheap thing, meant for a child, but Silas was already stripping the casing off a Valyrian emergency beacon he'd salvaged from her wreck. He didn't use a diagnostic terminal. He used his teeth to strip a wire and a bit of silver foil to bridge a burnt-out resistor. The drone's lights flickered to life, chirping a high-pitched Valyrian distress frequency. The swarm ship above pivoted, its sensors locking onto the massive energy signature emanating from the tiny plastic toy. It began its descent, the massive weight of the vessel pushing aside the clouds as it hovered over the center of the frozen lake at the mountain's base. Silas sent the drone spiraling out over the ice. The dropship followed, its landing struts extending, eager to claim the high-value target it thought was hiding below. "The ice here is thin," Silas whispered, watching the massive ship settle. "It's a thermal vent." A groan like a dying god echoed through the valley. The thick ice shelf, burdened by the thousands of tons of alien alloy, spiderwebbed in a jagged, crystalline map. With a final, thunderous crack, the lake gave way. The swarm ship didn't just sink. It was swallowed, the freezing black water rushing into its heated engine cores and snapping the hull like glass. Silence returned to Oakhaven, save for the hiss of steam. Kaylin looked down at her leg. The strip of Silas's wool scarf was tattered, frozen stiff with her own blood and the spray of the lake. It was a worthless piece of fabric, yet it had cost this man his home and nearly his life to keep it wrapped around a stranger. She began to type her report into her bracer, her fingers trembling. She didn't write about the atmospheric composition or the mineral wealth of Earth. She wrote about the man in the scarf. "Earth is not a victim," she typed, watching the first light of dawn touch the peaks. "It is a protector, and they don't ask permission to be heroes." As the sun rose, she watched Silas stare at the empty space where his home had been, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked tired, but he didn't look defeated. "How do you think your leaders will react when they find out a toy drone and a wool scarf defeated their most advanced hunter-killer? We'll be here to tell the story when they arrive. Come back tomorrow for the next Chronicle of the Stars."